The historical books of the Old Testament, they remind us that times change, but God remains the same. Yesterday, today, and forever, He is the master of every moment. We saw last week that Elijah had to be reminded of that. And then King Ahab, he learned it at the ultimate cost. What we're looking at today, we will see how things continued to change, but still under God's constant control. His purpose, and according to what He had said in His earlier word, as He provided for the succession from Elijah to Elisha. What we want to understand from this is that the Lord's servants come and go, but He continues to provide the leadership for His people. So we should look to Him for that and ask Him to make Himself known both to us and through us. And so today also, we will be moving into 2 Kings. And so, like I said earlier on, when we started this series, it really was one book at one period of time. We're just rolling into the next one. And if you wanted to get ready, the page that we're going to be reading from in the Bibles that we provide here is page 258. But we're not going to start that just yet. And first, I wanted to briefly describe the story that the book opens with, because it's not really what we're going to focus on today, but just to understand the situation. Ahab's son, Ahaziah, became king after him, and he was as wicked as his father and his mother. And he reigned 2 years, and then he had an accident, an injury. It was a very serious one. And when that occurred, rather than seeking help from the Lord, he turned to Baal, as his parents had basically taught him to do, and so the Lord had him told that he would not recover. And so he died. And he was replaced by his brother, Ahab's second son, whose name was Joram. And we're going to see Joram come up for a little while here. He's the next king of Israel that we will be focused on for some time. But now Elijah was the one who told Ahaziah that he would die. And that was his last public prophetic act, because his time on earth had also come to an end. And that is what we are looking at. So this now is, like I said, on page 258 in the Bibles we provide, 2 Kings chapter 2 at verse 1. It says that it came to pass, when the Lord was about to take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. Then Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. Now the sons of the prophets who were at Bethel came out to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that the Lord will take away your master from over you today?" And he said, "Yes, I know. Keep silent." Then Elijah said to him, "Elisha, stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to Jericho." But he said, "As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So they came to Jericho. Now the sons of the prophets who were there came to Elisha and said to him, "Do you know that the Lord will take your master from over you today?" So he answered, "Yes, I know. Keep silent." Then Elijah said to him, "Stay here, please, for the Lord has sent me on to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. And 50 men of the sons of the prophets went and stood facing them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. Now Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water. And it was divided this way and that, so that the two of them crossed over on dry ground. And so it was, when they had crossed over, that Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask, what may I do for you before I am taken away from you?" And Elisha said, "Please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me." So he said, "You have asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if not, it shall not be so." Then it happened, as they continued on and talked, that suddenly a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it. And he cried out, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen." And so he saw him no more. And he took hold of his own clothes and tore them into 2 pieces. And he also took up the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him, and went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the mantle of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water and said, "Where is the Lord God of Elijah?" And when he also had struck the water, it was divided this way and that. And Elisha crossed over. When the Lord spoke to Elijah on Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai, he told him that his plan would soon have new executors, new people to carry them out. So telling him, in other words, Elijah, you're only part of the plan. What we just read is his part coming to an end. But what a spectacular send-off it was. Unlike everyone else who has ever lived except for Enoch, Elijah did not die. Instead, he was taken up directly to heaven. And there is basically a reflection here. This reflects his victory over the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, because fire, once again, comes from the sky. But rather than to consume, as it was in that moment, this time it was to elevate. As the Lord once again showed the power over life and death that no lifeless idol possesses. No force can resist his might. And it is a remarkable conclusion for Elijah. But we want to notice, this really is Elisha's story. And so he knew what was coming, as did the other prophets along the way. He was no longer going to be following Elijah anymore. Rather, he was going to be leading in his own right. Seems he wasn't quite ready for that yet, though. To have to sink or swim on his own. He'd grown used to, and we can obviously see he had grown fond of Elijah's leadership. Now, that's not to say that Elisha had misgivings, as though he had doubts about what he was going to do. It's just that he wanted to respect his master to the very end and give him the proper goodbye before setting out on his own. And so he followed him one last time, and then also used it as an opportunity to make a request. He asks Elijah for a double portion of the older prophet's spirit. Now, that's not really him asking for double his power, or even really a piece of his spirit, like it's somehow transferable. What he's really saying is that he wanted evidence that he was Elijah's heir. That's what a double portion was an inheritance. That was what he was asking for, to prove that he was the successor to Elijah's ministry. He's asking, in essence, to be able to perform the same types of miracles. That's the idea. Now, of course, he's asking the wrong person. Elijah couldn't grant his request. It was up to God. But Elijah did let Elisha know what the proof would be if his prayer was heard. And we know that it was, because Elisha saw those chariots of fire. He clearly knew he had his answer because of that, which is important. He knew he had his answer. That's important for understanding his prayer in verse 14 there, where he asks, "Where is the Lord God?" That's not an expression of doubt on his part. Is God going to answer? It's also not a demand. I want to understand that. Where are you? Prove it. You need to do this. That's not the idea either. This is faithful expectation that he would be heard again. And that while Elijah might be gone, the Lord who is God is not. So really, him asking the question was evidence for the other people who were watching that Elisha was the chosen leader for the new generation. And the whole story, taken together, is meant to show how God is the one who chooses the leaders for every generation. Moses was the greatest prophet of Israel, and we have seen on a few occasions how Elijah's ministry reflected his. That's going on again here. When Elijah made dry ground over the river, that was reflecting on how Moses had done that through the Red Sea. And then on top of that, the place where Elijah was taken up into heaven was the same place, on that side of that very same river, where Moses had been taken by God to die. So it's tying them together one last time. But even more than that, it points to the idea of succession. Because when Moses died, Joshua took over. Joshua succeeded him, began to lead Israel, and basically the first thing he did was there was a miracle where the waters of the Jordan were parted so that the Israelites could cross over it. Well, then that's exactly what Elisha does on his return trip. It's all tying together. Moses to Joshua, Elijah to Elisha, they are all part of the same story, same plan. God using them to show that He is present, real, powerful, and loving towards those who respond to His leading, as He has made clear through the course of all history. Elisha was being encouraged to know that. Those other prophets were being encouraged to know that. And so are we. Now, this doesn't mean that we can just demand any display that we want. So again, take that wrong attitude. Well, where are you, Lord? You need to prove it by doing this for me. That's not the idea. Elisha had a specific part to play. Performing miracles like Elijah was what was going to prove that he was following in Elijah's footsteps and therefore should be listened to, as the other prophet had been. We are not going to see those precise same things because our parts are different. And the word is already here. We have it. So we don't need those spectacular things. And we can't expect God to do more than He says He will. But we should boldly trust Him to do all that He says He will. We have it. We should be working to know it, to rely on it, no matter who we are. So that's the next aspect that I want to focus on here. Following this moment, Elisha did perform a number of miracles, and often they were in reflection of the things that Elijah had done, multiplying food, calling down judgment against evildoers, even raising the dead. But I want to focus on what is arguably his most unique miracle in the sense that it's not really like anything that Elijah had done before. This was something pretty much new. And so this is in 2 Kings chapter 5 now, and we're going to start there with verse 1. It says, Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, If only my master were with the prophet who's in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. Naaman went in and told his master, the king, saying, Thus and thus said the girl who's from the land of Israel. And then the king of Syria said, Go now, and I'll send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. Then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, Now be advised when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. And it happened when the king of Israel read the letter that he tore his clothes and said, Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me. So it was when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel. We're told a fair bit about this Naaman character, but not as much as we would maybe, as curiosity, would like to know. Syria, the nation, has been mentioned a few times in Kings up to this point, but they were actually the ones who had killed Ahab that we saw last week. But Naaman hasn't cut up before, so we don't know the nature of his military victories, why he was so important to the king. Another question we can kind of ask is, how long did he have a skin condition? Was it something that he had to deal with his entire life? So he had kind of had to pick himself up by his bootstraps in order to overcome people's perception of him because of how he looked. Or was it something that developed later, a new challenge he had to face after he had thought he'd reached the pinnacle of success? We don't know. It's ambiguous. That ambiguity can be kind of valuable because it allows us to read ourselves into the story. Whether we're facing an old problem or a new problem, we can kind of apply it. Now, the one thing that we do know is that he and his king were the enemies of Israel because, like I said, they killed Ahab. And for another thing that we are told as far as Naaman himself is concerned, that he had taken Israelites in raids in order to make them slaves. So it's ironic then that one of his captives ends up actually providing for his rescue by pointing him to the Lord. Not that she was exactly specific in that. She didn't name God. You notice she didn't even name the prophet. She just said that there was one. But that was enough to get him started. So there's apparently a ceasefire, a moment of peace that was occurring between the countries. So Naaman went to Israel with a letter of introduction from his king, which seemed likely to cause an international incident. Because this is all like a game of telephone, really. Only the Lord can provide healing, but the servant girl pointed to the prophet without even specifying who Naaman should talk to, which resulted in the Syrian king assuming that it must have been somebody who was employed by the Israelite king, which is why he made healing Naaman into King Joram's responsibility. And since Joram didn't have that ability, it seemed to him that this couldn't be anything other than a provocation to war. Interestingly, though, Joram does, perhaps accidentally, but he does get things back on track because he hits on the truth. God alone has the ultimate power over life. And so, Elisha, responding to his concern, he sends to let him know to send the Syrian his way, for the Lord's presence and power to be proved. Continuing at verse 9, says that Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean." But Naaman became furious, and went away, and said, "Indeed, I said to myself, he'll surely come out to me, and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the place, and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went away in a rage. But his servants came near and spoke to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? Well, how much more then when he says to you, just wash and be clean?" So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God. And his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And he returned to the man of God, he and all his aides, and came and stood before him and said, "Indeed, now I know there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Now therefore, please take a gift from your servant." But he said, "As the Lord lives before whom I stand, I will receive nothing." And he urged him to take it, but still he refused. So Naaman said, "Well then, if not, please let your servant be given 2 mule loads of earth. For your servant will no longer offer either burnt offering or sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. Yet in this thing may the Lord pardon your servant. When my master goes into the temple of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please pardon your servant in this thing." And then he said to him, "Go in peace." So he departed from him a short distance. There are 2 things that we really want to take away from this miraculous healing, even more than the healing itself. The first is that for as amazing as this ended up being, it starts in simplicity. And that simplicity is actually the challenge. It's Naaman's bar to entry. He had the expectation of something showy, the way that human religion usually is. That Elisha would come out in order to slather praise over his illustrious guest in the first place, and then accept his very rich payment, and then put on a show, to invoke the Lord's response. The sort of thing that the prophets of Baal had done on Mount Carmel. That's what he thought Elisha would do. Instead, in spite of having called for him, he doesn't even come out to see him. He acts like he has no time for Naaman and tells him to go take a dip. That to a man like Naaman, that was an insult. And it may very well have provoked the war that Joram was so worried about. But once again, a servant speaks up and saves the day. If it is that unimpressive, if it's that easy, is it really asking too much to try? Naaman, he had some humility. He was able to admit the logic in that, and so he went to the Jordan and received his desire. Which leads us to the other thing that we really want to focus on. Because once he was healed, Naaman realized he'd been looking for the wrong thing in the wrong place. It wasn't Elisha who was capable of manipulating Yahweh into providing a blessing. That's how paganism says that things work. You placate the gods. You trick them, basically, into giving you what you want, which they're not really predisposed to do. Rather, it's the Lord who is the one who is loving and chooses to act and must be approached in humility because he alone can provide. Naaman's realization of that is what got him what he was looking for. And it finally helps us understand why all of this even happened in the first place. Because it's supposed to, it maybe doesn't so much us because we're looking at this from a different cultural context, but you should realize this seems absurd. Why would Elisha, why would the Lord help somebody who's not just a foreigner, he is an out-and-out enemy of Israel, a killer and a maker of slaves? But it's because God desires people of all nations to know, as we have seen the meaning of the name Elijah, the Lord alone is God. And to know the meaning of the name Elisha, God alone saves. That changing hearts is greater than punishing enemies. And Naaman's heart clearly was changed. He returned with a commitment to serve the Lord alone. Though he does ask for a special dispensation in regard to the temple that was in Syria, that was to be able to honor his king. It sort of ties into what we saw in 1 Corinthians. He is already saying, Ramon is not a god, this is just politics. And that is what believers actually know. That was what Elijah had started to teach in his mockery of Baal. There is nothing else. God's alone. He's the only one who's worshipful. That was what this was teaching. Now, in order to have reinforced that God's acceptance of outsiders was the purpose of this miracle, of Naaman's healing, that was why Elisha refused to be rewarded for it. Because if he had taken all that money, it could have kind of sent the lesson, well, God accepts anybody if you can pay. But that's not true, and so that's why he didn't do that. Sadly, the story doesn't end there. This is what we read in chapter 5 at verse 20 now. Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, "Look, my master has spared Naaman the Syrian, while not receiving from his hands what he brought. But as the Lord lives, I'll run after him and take something from him." So Gehazi pursued Naaman. When Naaman saw him running after him, he got down from the chariot to meet him and said, Is all well? He said, "All is well, but my master has sent me, saying, Indeed, just now 2 young men of the sons of the prophets have come to me from the mountains of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of garments." So Naaman said, "Please take 2 talents. And he urged him, as though he needed urging, and bound 2 talents of silver into 2 bags with 2 changes of garments and handed them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them on ahead of him. When he came to the citadel, he took them from their hand and stored them away in the house. Then he let the men go, and they departed. Now he went in and stood before his master. Elisha said to him, "Where did you go, Gehazi?" And he said, "Your servant did not go anywhere." Then he said to him, "Did not my heart go with you when the man turned back from his chariot to meet you? Is it time to receive money and to receive clothing? Olive groves and vineyards and sheep and oxen and male and female servants. Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and your descendants forever." And he went out from his presence, leprous, as white as snow. This is a terrible thing. Gehazi had an amazing position, being able to be so close to the prophet. Really, he was in the same position that Elisha had been with Elijah. That's how close he was. That's the access he had. But it went to his head. His error starts with a sense of justification, as sin so often does. Naaman was a Syrian. He was an enemy. Why should he get off scot-free? He should at least have to pay. And Elisha had provided a service. Something should have been earned for that. That was what he told himself, was that it was right. And so that's why Gehazi swore in the Lord's name that he would take something. But even though he told himself it was right, he clearly knew he was doing something wrong. Those justifications, that was really just him lying to himself, and that's why he told the other lies that he did too. Naaman was deceived by them easily enough because he'd been willing to pay already anyway, so he sees no problem with it. We have to hope that there's no harm that was done by this, especially since, in relative terms, it was a small amount. Gehazi had been careful not to let his reach exceed his grasp, so he only asked for a little bit of what Naaman brought. But still, even if he never knew it, Naaman had been defrauded. This was stolen from him. And even more importantly than the wrong of that, it stood the chance of undermining that lesson that Elisha meant to teach him, which is that God's grace is free. So, did he no longer know that because of what Gehazi did? We don't know. I hope not. Unfortunately for Gehazi, Elisha saw with clearer eyes. So the lies did him no good that time. He was even given a final chance to tell the truth, either in repentance for realizing what he'd done was wrong, or at least if he could have just had the courage of his convictions and said, "Yeah, I took something. We needed to do that." But no, he attempted to cover it up and was shown how high of a price the Lord places on truth. Naaman had been cleansed and welcomed. He was an outsider brought in. Gehazi was cursed and therefore ostracized, an insider cast out. And so what we see in this, what we're looking at today, is that, as always, Scripture is pointing out God's plan, the one that passed from Moses to Joshua, from Elijah to Elisha, to all the other saints, before them, between them, beyond them. There are these common threads that shows that the Lord has been weaving all of this together. And our part in it is especially highlighted by Naaman. He reminds us of the position that we are in. By sin, which is doing what God says not to or not doing what God says to, we become his enemies. What Naaman was to Israel is what we were to God. So we find ourselves unclean, leprous. We are unwelcome. We are broken and shut out. And in that state of brokenness, what we tend to assume is that fixing it, gaining entry, is a matter of what we can pay. That as long as we can do enough, we can convince God that he should help us. And we hope that religious spectacles will allow us to prove our worthiness. But God's plan does not work that way, because we have nothing to give him. It's all his in the first place. We can't impress him. Instead, we can only, instead of having pride, which people have spent a month celebrating, we are supposed to be humble and take the simple step of faith in what he has done. What he did by sending his son to be the one who actually paid the price. Dying on the cross so his blood could wash away our moral deformity, and rising to life so that we could step out of the flood and not be swept away by eternal death. We belong outside. Nobody really likes to hear that. That's the position that we put ourselves in, is that we belong outside. But he opened the door to the kingdom of heaven and extends the invitation freely so that we simply have to receive it. And when we do and submit to Christ, we belong. And that belonging cannot be taken away. But we still need to take the warning from Gehazi so that we actually know, first of all, that we really do belong. Because this is a question that, being close to Elisha wasn't enough to help him. Proximity was not identity. In the same way, I bring this up sometimes, you can sit in a garage all day, right? Doesn't make you a car. You can't call yourself one in that case. It's the same basic idea. There are a lot of people who think that because they sit in a church that it makes them a Christian. That because their parents said that this is what we are, that makes them a Christian. We know that's not the case. We should know that's not the case. There's a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of churches who do not know that. To them, it's basically an ethnicity. It's something that they inherit rather than something that they actually choose. It needs to be chosen. We have to actually offer our hearts to the Lord as Naaman did. Gehazi never did that. So he wasn't in the position of strength that he thought he was. Secondly, we must not put stumbling blocks in anyone's way. Gehazi resented seeing someone rewarded when he didn't think that person deserved it, and he wanted a reward for what he felt he deserved when he had done nothing. He wasn't involved in the healing at all. And in spite of the fact that that reward that he wanted, it actually went against God's purposes. We have to be careful to not get things so completely backward. If we know that we have gone from being the Lord's enemies to being his friends, we shouldn't begrudge that to anyone else. And we shouldn't make personal gain our chief, our only motivation. Not with all that God has already given us. If we do, we send the wrong message about what the Christian life is for. And we might be keeping people from understanding where the way to heaven is actually found. We can't get in the way like that. So for anybody who is not a Christian, and maybe you happen upon this online and you see this, I hope that you can understand what we're talking about. I hope you can see yourself in Naaman's experience. Now, maybe you feel like you've been struggling for recognition your whole life. Or maybe things have generally been good, but you have recent events that have got you reeling. I don't know. Don't know that any more than I know what brought Naaman to the point of looking in unexpected places for answers. But ultimately, he was willing to put aside his pride and his expectations and what he could do, what he could bring to the table. He simply believed and accepted help from the Lord. That is what you have to do. There are so many people who think my life is a mess and I really should be going to church, but I need to get it together first. And then I'll be good enough for him. You have it backward. You cannot be good enough for Him. You cannot pull yourself together. You just have to come to Him. He will do it. This is not for merely the removal of a physical mark. This is for the cleansing of what mars your soul. And it cannot be found in anything that you can do for yourself. There is not some grand gesture to perform. That's already been done when Jesus died and rose for you. So little is really asked of you. It is so simple. Don't let that simplicity be what keeps you away. You only have to trust in Him. Are you ready to do that today? It's a decision that can be made from anywhere. But if anybody wants to make that here, or you have questions about it, during the time leading up to communion, right after this message is over, there's a song that's going to play. I'll be standing off to the side, and if anybody wants to talk, we can go into that back room there to be able to do that. Now, believers, the Lord's plan carries on. The unstoppable day is approaching when we will be caught up to heaven with Jesus. We are statistically, I guess, more likely to be among the many who await that day after our physical death. Or we might experience something more like Elijah did and be one of those few who will be awake to hear the shout. But whatever the case may be, we have work to do in the meantime. And that's all that really matters. Remembering that we have no right within ourselves, we are not so good and great that we deserve to fly with the chariots and the horsemen of the God of Israel, but we'll do it because it's His blessing to the enemies that He made His friends. So we shouldn't see anyone else as being beyond saving if we were not. We should not seek to use the people around us, but to be useful in showing them that salvation is freely available to all those who accept the covering of Christ.